destruction doesn't require scandal. It doesn't need shouting nor tears. It doesn't depend on explicit revenge or visible justice. The most effective form of annihilation is cold, invisible, silent, and therefore lethal. Machiavelli never wrote about killing with weapons, but taught how to kill without raising suspicion, by killing a name, prestige, presence. His true teaching wasn't about ruling kingdoms. It was about dominating perception. And that's why the weak will never understand this video, because they still believe that to win against someone, you must attack. What they don't realize is that by attacking, you lower yourself. You step into the ring, you join the theater, you become part of the same mud. And in that exact moment, you lose something you'll never get back. Mystery, silence, dominion. Think about it. Have you ever seen a king scream to prove he's a king? Have you ever seen a master beg for recognition? Real power is felt, not announced. That's why this video is not for those who want to react. It's for those who want to reign. Because today, you'll discover how to destroy someone without ever raising your voice, without responding to a single provocation, without even looking your enemy in the eye. And once it ends, you'll understand why the most feared figures in history weren't the loudest, but the most unreachable. They didn't win battles, they turned their opponents to dust before the first sword was drawn. So if you've ever been disrespected, manipulated, or betrayed, and you responded with fury, you've already lost once. But now you'll learn how never to lose again. They expect you to react. That's the trap. The first strike of any enemy is neither physical nor direct. It's an emotional bait. A subtle comment, a public accusation, a provocation disguised as a joke. And most people fall for it. They respond with outrage, defend themselves, shout, explain. The mistake is already made, because what looks like strength, responding, confronting, is actually surrender. Surrendering your focus, your control, your narrative. Machiavelli would never say respond. He would smile in silence, because he knew real power lies not in reacting, but in observing, in letting the enemy confuse noise with progress. Silence, when intentional, isn't absence. It's absolute control. Sun Tzu, in his treatise on war, said that supreme excellence consists in defeating the enemy without fighting. And silence is that invisible tactic. It doesn't just disarm, it embarrasses. When someone attacks you and you don't respond, you put them in front of a mirror that reflects only their own desperation. Silence is cruel because it exposes but never answers. It highlights the ridiculous without ever saying, "You're being ridiculous." And that's the beauty. The enemy stumbles on their own without a push, while you simply exist, calm, composed, present. Silence, contrary to what we were taught, is not weakness. Weakness is needing noise to prove you're right. Most people have been conditioned to react. We grew up hearing that silence means guilt, that not defending yourself is cowardice, that those who remain quiet are wrong. That's false. That's what the weak teach so that everyone plays their game. The game of impulsiveness, emotional chaos, reverse logic, where the loudest is mistaken for the strongest. Machiavelli understood that the world isn't ruled by the just, but by the intelligent. And the intelligent know that every reaction is an entrance onto the stage, and the fewer stages you step onto, the more untouchable you become. Picture a social courtroom. Everyone's watching. The enemy starts to speak. They accuse, insinuate, expect your counterattack, but you don't give them one. You observe, silent, secure, like someone who holds a trump card they don't need to show. Slowly, the audience starts to wonder, why is only one person speaking? Why do they seem so agitated? Why are they trying so hard to convince? The silent judgment of the crowd begins to operate, and you still haven't said a word, because you're already winning. Baltasar Gracian, a 17th century courtier and master of dissimulation, taught that true greatness doesn't exhibit itself. It imposes itself through contrast. And silence is the greatest contrast in a world obsessed with attention. That's why it humiliates so deeply, because those who desperately need to be seen fall apart when ignored. And that unraveling is visible, it's public, and it's self-inflicted. You don't need to dirty yourself with attacks, you just need to maintain your composure. But make no mistake, this silence is not passivity, it's calculation, it's strategy. It's the art of widening the gap between you and the other until they can no longer reach you. When someone attacks you and you respond with a slight smile, take a deep breath and change the subject. something shifts. The atmosphere changes. The attacker expected war. You gave indifference. And in that moment, they realize they're not facing an equal, they're facing a wall of ice. And walls don't respond, they only reflect what's in front of them. This kind of silence, lethal, elegant, firm, must be trained. It requires self-control, mastery of your own emotions, the absence of a wounded ego. And that's why so few practice it. Because the ego wants revenge. The ego wants justice. But the strategist doesn't play for ego, they play for effect. And the effect of well-placed silence is worth more than 1,000 brilliant responses. What no one told you is that the true collapse of an enemy doesn't begin when you attack. It begins when they realize that nothing they do can pull you off center. The center is your throne, and silence is the scepter you hold without gripping. The one who attacks wants to make you dance on their stage, but you respond with absence, and that absence weighs more. Heavier than any speech, because what is not said cannot be challenged. What is not explained cannot be twisted. What does not react dominates. And it's precisely that invisible dominion that opens the door to the second phase of destruction. When silence becomes strategic absence. When you not only don't respond, but begin to withdraw with elegance. When your presence, once constant, starts to be missed. And that absence doesn't create nostalgia. It creates instability. The enemy who once screamed to get your attention now screams to no one. And the echo of their own voice becomes unbearable. The collapse of an enemy doesn't begin with a direct attack. It begins with the realization that they no longer matter. Ignoring someone is not withdrawing attention, it's stripping away meaning. And that's why it's so devastating. The most common mistake made by someone who's attacked is to try to prove their worth, to defend themselves, to fix the narrative, to show everyone they're the victim of injustice. But in doing so, the victim validates the aggressor, gives them a stage, gives them light, gives them context. And Machiavelli knew, to give context to an enemy is to give them power. Silence is only the first strike. Strategic absence, that is the fatal blow. Because ignoring isn't about closing your eyes, it's about shifting your gaze. It's making the other disappear from your emotional and strategic field of vision. And when you ignore with class, you're not getting revenge. You're vanishing. You're stepping away from the places where they once found you. And that forces them to shout louder, to try harder, to launch new attacks. But the more noise they make, the more out of place they seem. And the more out of place they appear, the more the environment starts to question them. Why is someone so obsessed with someone who doesn't retaliate, who only grows in silence? This is the difference between a fight and a fall. In a fight, both sides engage. In a fall, only one struggles, and the other simply walks away, subtly, without announcement, without confrontation. They stop including, stop inviting, stop replying, and they do it with polite grace, almost imperceptibly. It's the invisible cut. It doesn't bleed outwardly, but it corrodes from within, and no one can pinpoint the exact moment it happened. They just feel that it did. The truth is that humans fear two things: contempt and oblivion. Being despised is painful, but being forgotten is unbearable. And strategic absence puts you above both. You don't show contempt. You simply don't mention them. And that social indifference breaks any narrative, because every attempt to reach you feels misplaced, unreciprocated. The aggressor starts to look needy. That's when humiliation begins to seep in. The audience, once uncertain, starts to laugh, not at you, at them. Nietzsche wrote that whoever fights monsters should take care not to become one. And that's exactly what the ignored person does. They refuse to become like their opponent. They choose not to fight. They choose to grow. Because the real response to an attack isn't a reaction, it's advancement. And to advance, in this context, means removing the enemy from the equation of your existence. They stop being an obstacle and become a forgotten detail. What's most cruel about this strategy is that it looks gentle. You were never hostile, never insulted, never attacked. You just stopped showing up. And no one can blame you for that. No one can point a finger and say you're the villain. But everyone feels something was lost. And what was lost wasn't just the relationship. It was the privilege of existing in your presence. Because true power lies in being desired in the spaces where you no longer exist. The enemy at this point begins to panic, They try to replicate your presence. They talk about you constantly. They become monothematic. And the more they mention you, the more it reveals that you still live inside them, while they no longer live inside you. And that's when the balance tips completely. Because the world sees who is obsessed, who is still trapped, who needs to prove something, and who simply moved on. If Machiavelli were alive today, he wouldn't use swords. He'd use unspoken invitations, unanswered messages, doors quietly closed. Because today, power doesn't belong to the loudest, it belongs to the one who doesn't need to announce their departure. And what remains for the enemy is an attempt to reach you. But there's no longer an address, no arena. You left the game, leaving only silence behind. And in that space, contrast sets in. A brutal contrast between what is said and what is lived. Between the narrative they try to build and the image you project simply by existing. The absence you constructed isn't retreat, it's elevation. And the world feels it, not immediately, but they feel it, because everyone can sense who lost access. And what they lost wasn't the argument, it was influence, prestige, proximity to someone who is now too far away to be attacked. And that strategic absence, that orchestra of empty spaces and retracted access, prepares the next and final move. It's not enough to ignore the enemy. You must grow so much that they stop being a threat, that they become obsolete. Not because they were defeated, but because they were outgrown. You don't need to defeat your enemy, you need to make them irrelevant. And irrelevance isn't imposed through force, it's achieved through elevation. The final and most sophisticated form of destruction isn't the one that knocks the other down, but the one that leaves them behind, in a stage where their presence no longer has any effect on you. This is where the game changes, because there's no more conflict, no more competition. There's only distance, a growing, irreversible distance that they can't shorten. You're not above because you declared yourself superior. You're above because you created a reality where they no longer factor in. That's why true strategists don't win arguments, don't win fights. They change rooms, change audiences, change codes. While the other tries to hit you with old weapons, offense, provocation, gossip, you're already speaking a different language to a different crowd on a different level. The fight keeps happening, but now in your absence. And absence at this point is no longer physical. It's symbolic transcendence. Machiavelli taught that the best way to neutralize a rival is to become indispensable. You become so relevant, so useful, so necessary that any attempt to diminish you sounds absurd. And when the enemy tries to repeat old accusations, they simply no longer stick. Because the context has changed, because the audience has changed, because you've changed, and they stayed the same. This is the silent victory. The victory that needs no applause or headlines. The victory that happens the moment you become unreachable. The other still runs, still barks, still tries, but they're chasing a version of you that no longer exists. They're fighting ghosts while you live new realities. And then, without a single word against, without a single hostile gesture, you win. Because the worst pain for someone who tried to destroy you is realizing they failed. But the most humiliating pain is realizing that while they tried, you grew, you multiplied, you evolved, and now they simply have no way to be part of your story. Be honest, have you ever felt that no matter how hard you try, no one truly sees you? It's not about lacking value. It's about knowing how to make it visible. The social game isn't fair. If you don't know the rules, you're left behind, but you don't have to stay invisible. In the Anti-Weak audiobook, I share 22 strategies to master interactions, gain respect, and step out of the shadows. Click the link in the description now and start the transformation only you can make happen.